300 million years ago, there was no Sahara, no Amazon, no Atlantic Ocean. The continents were still locked together, and a warm, shallow sea stretched across much of what is now land. Below its surface, covering the ground beneath what would one day become cities, countries, entire civilizations, was a world so dense with life that nothing in today's ocean comes close to it. If you could somehow stand on that seafloor, you would not recognize a single thing around you. Not because it was empty, because it was the opposite. Every surface covered, every patch of seafloor claimed, creatures stacked on top of creatures, feeding, filtering, building, a system so intricately connected that pulling one piece of it apart would have unraveled something much larger. It had been running like that for tens of millions of years, stable, layered, extraordinarily alive, and then something ended it, almost all of it, so completely that entire groups of animals, creatures that had held their place on that seafloor for longer than the dinosaurs would ever exist, vanished without a single living descendant. We know they were there. We can hold what is left of them in our hands, but the world they built, the world they lived in for hundreds of millions of years, is so far outside anything alive today that reconstructing it is one of the stranger challenges in all of paleontology. Today, we go back to that seafloor, to the animals that owned it, the world they built, and the question of what it actually takes to erase something that permanent. Before we go back, drop a comment with where you are in the world. Somewhere beneath you, there is a good chance that ocean floor still exists, locked inside the rock under your feet. Now settle in. This one goes back a long way. Long before familiar coastlines settled into their present shapes, the surface of the planet was arranged in a way that feels almost abstract to imagine, a slow gathering of land into a single vast mass, while water spread outward to fill the rest. This stretch of time is divided into two adjoining chapters: the Carboniferous, spanning from 359 to 299 million years ago, followed seamlessly by the early Permian from 299 to 252 million years ago. Together they form a continuous window into a world that operated under different balances of air, water, and life, yet followed the same quiet physical laws that guide the ocean tonight. The continents were not scattered but converging, assembling into the immense body known as Pangaea. Around it lay Panthalassa, an ocean so large it wrapped almost the entire globe without interruption. Along the edges of this supercontinent, broad continental shelves extended outward beneath shallow water, forming wide inland seas positioned near the equator. These waters were warm and clear, carrying a chemical richness that encouraged the formation of shells, skeletons, and mineral structures with unusual efficiency. Conditions were not simply favorable, they were precise, tuned over millions of years into a state where life could build itself upward and outward with remarkable density. The atmosphere above this ocean held a different composition than the one we breathe now. Oxygen levels reached approximately 35%, far above the 21% of the present day. This surplus was not accidental, but the result of immense forests spreading across the land, drawing carbon dioxide from the air and locking it into buried plant matter. As carbon was removed, oxygen accumulated, and this abundance did not remain confined to the air. It dissolved into the shallow seas, enriching the water and supporting organisms that depended on constant, efficient respiration. The ocean floor in these regions was fed not only by sunlight from above, but by the chemistry of the planet itself, creating a foundation that allowed life to gather in extraordinary numbers. At the same time, carbon dioxide levels were falling, and the global climate responded with cycles of cooling, Glaciers expanded and retreated across portions of the supercontinent, storing and releasing vast quantities of water. Each advance lowered sea levels, exposing sections of the shallow shelf, while each retreat returned the sea, flooding the land once more. These repeating pulses reshaped the margins of the ocean again and again, clearing space, redistributing nutrients, and allowing new communities to establish themselves where others had recently disappeared. Change was not abrupt but rhythmic, a slow oscillation that continuously refreshed the living surface below. That surface was not an empty expanse of sediment. It was fully inhabited, structured and layered with a complexity that resembles an organized landscape more than an open plain. Every small area was occupied by organisms adapted to specific conditions, some anchored to firm substrates, others embedded within softer layers, each finding a precise position relative to light, current, and chemistry. Movement through this environment was constrained not by distance, but by density, as life filled nearly every available space. This realm is known as the benthic zone, the lowest layer of the ocean where the water meets the ground and where entire communities live on and within the substrate. It is here that the focus settles, not on the vastness above, but on the narrow boundary where chemistry, structure, and biology converge. The story from this point forward remains close to that surface, where the architecture of an ancient ecosystem begins to take shape, built slowly from the remains of what came before and sustained by the conditions that allowed it to endure. Beneath the quiet movement of those ancient waters, the ground itself was not a fixed surface, but an accumulation in constant transformation, a slow settling of fragments that never truly came to rest. What appears from a distance to be pale sediment was in fact composed almost entirely of the remains of earlier life, shells broken down into fine grains, skeletal pieces worn smooth by time and motion, layered until they formed a thick, yielding foundation that extended deep below the visible surface. This accumulation reached considerable depth in many regions, not as a solid bed, but as a shifting, responsive material shaped by both biology and chemistry. Within this layer, processes unfolded continuously. Calcium and carbonate, released from the dissolving fragments below, moved upward through the water in subtle currents, becoming available once more to the organisms anchored above. Nothing here was static. The floor participated in the life above it, feeding it, sustaining it, and quietly receiving it again when each organism's time ended. Growth and decay existed in the same space, inseparable, each one shaping the other in a cycle that never paused. Across this surface, structure emerged with surprising precision. Life arranged itself according to gradients that were almost invisible, small differences in depth, slight variations in light, gentle shifts in current. Some organisms settled just beneath the uppermost layer, partially buried, yet still exposed enough to draw in nutrients. Others attached themselves to firmer fragments rising above the sediment, positioning their bodies where passing water carried a steady flow of suspended material. Each occupied a narrow range of conditions, and together they formed a layered system, not chaotic but ordered, with boundaries defined by chemistry and movement rather than by physical walls. From within this living ground, larger forms began to rise. These were not reefs in the sense familiar today, but frameworks built by organisms whose forms no longer exist. Rugose corals, solitary and horn-shaped, extended upward from the sediment, each individual anchored in place, yet forming dense groupings across wide areas. Alongside them grew tabulate corals, colonial in structure, their surfaces patterned in repeating geometric cells that spread outward and upward. Over time, These organisms created rigid structures that projected above the surrounding floor, introducing vertical complexity into an otherwise level environment. Between these corals, other builders filled the spaces left behind. Stromatoporoids, with their layered sponge-like bodies, expanded outward, binding separate elements into a cohesive mass. Their growth sealed gaps, strengthened connections, and transformed loose assemblages into stable formations. The result was not a collection of individual organisms, but a unified structure, solid enough to resist the movement of water and persistent enough to remain in place for long spans of time. These formations altered the surrounding environment in subtle but important ways. Overhangs formed where growth extended outward, casting narrow bands of shadow. Small openings developed between structures, creating passages where water slowed or accelerated depending on the shape of the space. Crevices and enclosed pockets appeared, each offering a distinct set of conditions that different organisms could occupy. The floor was no longer uniform. It had become varied, textured, and increasingly complex. Rising above this framework, a different presence took shape. Crinoids extended upward from the substrate, their slender stems supporting crowns of delicate branching arms. Though they resembled plants in form, they were animals, and their arms moved continuously with the current, capturing passing particles and guiding them toward a central mouth. Some reached heights approaching a meter, and when gathered in large numbers, they formed a canopy that hovered above the structures below. This canopy filtered the water, altered its flow, and cast shifting patterns across the surfaces beneath. The entire environment took on a layered arrangement, a three-dimensional system in which each level supported the next. The sediment below functioned as a base, the reef structures rose as solid frameworks, and the crinoid fields extended above as a living cover. Every surface, every opening, every slight variation in form became a place where life could exist. There was little emptiness. Presence filled nearly all available space, from the deepest layers of sediment to the highest reaching arms moving gently in the current. Within this arrangement, countless organisms lived out their cycles, each adapted to a precise position within the whole, each contributing to the structure that supported the others. The ground, the framework, and the canopy were not separate systems, but interconnected parts of a single environment, sustained by the same flow of materials and energy. And within that layered world, enclosed by structures built from what had already lived and died, the presence of its inhabitants began to define the shape of everything around them. There are places within that layered expanse where the eye would find almost no open ground, where every surface, every slight elevation, every fragment of stable structure was occupied by living forms, pressed closely together, each one anchored, feeding, growing, and leaving little space between itself and the next. In these regions, the most common presence was not a creature that moved freely through the water, but one that remained fixed, its body opening and closing with a quiet rhythm, responding to the steady passage of current. These were brachiopods, animals that resemble clams in outward form, yet belong to a lineage that diverged from them more than 500 million years ago. Their shells enclosed a soft interior, but their true interaction with the surrounding water came from a delicate structure within, the lophophore, a coiled fan lined with fine cilia. This organ extended outward when conditions allowed, drawing water inward in a controlled flow, capturing microscopic particles suspended within it. The motion was continuous, precise, and efficient, allowing each individual to extract nourishment from a stream that never stopped moving. Across vast stretches of the floor, brachiopods gathered in numbers that are difficult to translate into modern terms. They did not appear in scattered clusters, but in continuous beds, layered one upon another, their shells forming a dense covering that replaced the underlying sediment almost entirely. Some species processed hundreds of liters of water in a single day, and when multiplied across entire communities, the effect on the surrounding environment became profound. The water passing through these fields was filtered repeatedly, stripped of suspended material, then carried onward to be used again by the organisms positioned beyond. At the height of their diversity, more than 3,000 distinct species of brachiopod occupied these environments, each adapted to slight variations in depth, current, or substrate. In the present day, only a few hundred remain, confined to limited habitats where conditions resemble those that once extended across entire continental margins. Their modern existence carries a faint echo of their former dominance, a reduced presence that hints at a much larger role now absent. Within the stone layers formed from this time, the accumulation of their shells remains visible. Entire rock formations consist almost entirely of their compressed remains, stacked so densely that individual forms blend into a continuous structure. In regions that would one day become parts of North America and Europe, these layers extend for meters, recording the long duration of their abundance and the stability of the conditions that allowed it. Interwoven with these fields were colonies of bryozoans, organisms that built intricate frameworks of calcium carbonate, branching outward in delicate patterns that resembled lace suspended in water. Each colony was composed of countless individual units, each one filtering water in the same manner as its neighbors, yet together forming a larger structure that rose above the surrounding surface. These formations provided shelter and attachment points for smaller organisms, creating additional layers of complexity within an already dense environment. Among them, blastoids introduced a different geometry. Their bodies formed precise symmetrical shapes, each one arranged in a 5-part pattern that reflected a strict internal order. Anchored to the substrate, they extended feeding structures outward, interacting with the surrounding water in a way that paralleled the other filter feeders, yet with a form that appeared almost engineered in its regularity. Their presence was widespread, and in certain regions their remains accumulated into thick deposits, contributing further to the structure of the floor itself. Together, these three groups formed the primary substance of the environment, not simply as individual organisms, but as the foundation upon which other forms of life depended. Creatures that moved through the water above relied on the productivity of these communities, while those that lived among them found both shelter and sustenance within their structures. The interactions between them created a system in which energy and material flowed continuously, supported by the steady activity of countless small bodies working in unison. In such a setting, open space was rare. The ground was not something that lay exposed, but something that was covered, built upon, and transformed by the presence of life itself, until the distinction between organism and environment became difficult to separate. Suspended above the crowded surface, a second layer of life unfolded in slow motion, rising from anchored stems and opening outward into forms that seemed almost weightless. These were the crinoids, often called sea lilies, though their stillness concealed a constant, deliberate activity. They did not drift passively in the current. They fed from it, shaped it, and in doing so became one of the defining presences of this world. Each individual was built around a central body from which arms extended in all directions, branching again and again into finer structures. Along these arms ran rows of tube feet, coated in a thin layer of mucus that interacted continuously with the water passing through. Any particle carried within that flow, whether a fragment of organic matter, a drifting larva, or a minute organism suspended in motion, was caught on contact. Once captured, it was guided along narrow grooves toward the center, where the mouth received a steady, uninterrupted supply. In some species, the number of arms reached into the hundreds, arranged in a radial pattern that allowed the organism to intercept water from multiple directions at once. When fully extended, a single crinoid could sweep an area broad enough to gather nourishment continuously without the need to move from its position. The surrounding current became part of its feeding mechanism. Each passing stream transformed into a source of sustenance. The bodies of these animals were supported by slender stalks, composed of stacked calcite discs, each one fitting precisely atop the next. These segments provided both flexibility and strength, allowing the crown above to sway gently while maintaining a firm connection to the substrate below. When a crinoid died, the connection between these discs weakened and the structure collapsed, scattering its components across the surface. Over time, these small circular fragments accumulated in great numbers, becoming a familiar feature within the rock record, their simple shapes marking the quiet end of once intricate forms. In regions where crinoids grew densely, their collective presence altered the behavior of the water itself. The movement of current slowed as it passed through their extended arms, its energy dissipated by the fine network of feeding structures. Suspended particles that might otherwise have remained in motion began to settle, drifting downward to the layers below. This process enriched the organisms beneath, providing a steady supply of material that supported the broader community. Not all crinoids remained fixed in place. Some evolved the ability to detach from the substrate, using their arms to move slowly through the water or across the surface. These free forms, often called feather stars, retained the same feeding structures but added a capacity for relocation, allowing them to respond to changes in their surroundings. Their movement was unhurried, a gradual repositioning rather than an escape, guided by shifts in current, light, and the availability of food. Despite their delicate appearance, crinoids were not without defenses. Fossil evidence preserves subtle traces of interaction, marks along the length of their stems where predators had attempted to feed. Early fish and primitive sharks targeted these structures, biting into the supporting columns in an effort to reach the softer tissues above. Some crinoids developed chemical compounds within their bodies, discouraging consumption, while others relied on the regenerative capacity of their tissues, replacing damaged parts over time. Within this canopy, life gathered in layers. Smaller organisms found shelter among the arms, protected from direct currents while still exposed to the flow of nutrients. Others moved along the stems, feeding on what accumulated there, or using the structure as a pathway through the dense environment. The crinoids themselves became both participants and providers, their presence shaping the distribution of life around them. The space they occupied was not separate from the surface below, but connected to it, forming a vertical extension of the same system. The ground supported the stalks lifted the crowns, and the crowns influenced the water that returned to the ground. Each level interacted with the others, creating a continuous exchange that sustained the entire structure. Within this layered arrangement, movement was constant, though rarely abrupt. The arms opened and closed, currents shifted, particles drifted and settled, and the quiet exchange between organism and environment continued without interruption. At certain moments, movement broke the slow rhythm of the canopy, a presence passing through with a form that did not match the patterns above or below. These were sharks, though not in the familiar sense, carried forward into the present. Their shapes did not follow a single design, nor did they converge toward the streamlined outline that would later define their lineage. Instead, they existed as a wide collection of forms, each one exploring a different arrangement of teeth, fins, and motion, as though the ocean itself were testing possibilities without settling on a final answer. One of the most unusual among them carried its teeth not in a simple row, but arranged in a continuous spiral embedded within the lower jaw. This animal, known as Helicoprion, bore a structure that curled inward upon itself, each tooth interlocking with the next, forming a smooth, expanding whorl. The pattern followed a precise curve, similar to the geometry seen in certain shells, though here it was composed entirely of hardened enamel. For many years, the placement of this structure remained uncertain, its purpose debated as specimens revealed only the spiral itself, detached from the rest of the body. Later examination using advanced imaging techniques clarified its position. The spiral sat at the back of the lower jaw, rotating inward as the animal closed its mouth. As prey was drawn toward it, the teeth engaged in sequence, slicing through soft tissue with a continuous motion rather than a single bite. The action resembled a mechanical process, steady and controlled, turning movement into cutting without interruption. This arrangement allowed Helicoprion to feed efficiently on organisms that lacked rigid protection, drawing them inward and reducing them as the spiral advanced. Another form, Adestus, carried a different approach. Its teeth extended outward in a single line from both the upper and lower jaws, projecting beyond the mouth itself. These teeth did not shed and replace in the manner seen in modern sharks. Instead, new growth pushed older teeth forward, creating elongated blades that met when the jaws closed. The result was a shearing motion, two edges passing across one another with a force that cut rather than crushed. This configuration produced a feeding mechanism unlike any living animal, a continuous extension of cutting surfaces maintained through constant growth. Smaller in size but no less distinct, Stethocanthus presented a shape that drew attention to its dorsal surface. Its back supported a flattened structure covered in denticles, tiny tooth-like scales that formed a textured platform. The purpose of this feature remains uncertain, though its presence suggests an interaction beyond simple movement through water. It may have served as a visual signal during close encounters, or as a form of mimicry, altering the outline of the animal in a way that influenced the behavior of others around it. Its exact role remains unresolved, preserved only in fragments that hint at function without confirming it. These forms were not brief or unsuccessful deviations. Helicoprion, in particular, persisted for approximately 30 million years, maintaining its distinctive structure across long spans of environmental change. Their disappearance does not reflect failure in design, but a shift in conditions that favored different forms over time. The ocean did not reject these shapes, it moved beyond them. The familiar silhouette of modern sharks, with streamlined bodies and uniform rows of teeth, emerged later, after these earlier forms had already established and relinquished their place. The period described here held a broader range of possibilities, a phase in which variation remained wide and outcomes were not yet narrowed by long-term selection. What remains of these animals is incomplete. Their skeletons, composed of cartilage rather than bone, rarely endure in full. Most of what is known comes from isolated elements, teeth preserved in stone, fragments of fin supports, impressions left in fine sediment. From these pieces, their forms are reconstructed, though the full extent of their diversity is likely greater than the record reveals. They moved through this environment with purpose, feeding, interacting, occupying roles shaped by their unusual structures. Yet even among them, there existed another presence that defined the upper limits of power within this system. There are forms in this ancient water that do not glide or circle, but advance with a deliberate contact against the ground, each movement pressing into the surface as if the weight of the animal belongs there. Among all the motion passing through this layered world, these were the dominant hunters, not fish, but eurypterids, often called sea scorpions, their ancestry reaching back more than 200 million years by the time this ocean took shape. They carried with them a long history of adaptation, refined across ages that preceded nearly everything sharing their environment. Their bodies were broad and segmented, encased in a hardened outer structure that provided both protection and leverage. The largest among them, Jacalopterus rhenanii, extended to a length of roughly 2.5 meters, a scale that placed it among the largest arthropods to have ever existed. Its proportions gave it a presence that combined weight and reach, a form capable of interacting with its surroundings through both strength and control. The surface beneath it was not simply a place to move across, but a medium it could engage with, using its limbs to navigate, probe, and position itself with precision. Movement was achieved through a combination of walking and swimming, each adapted to different conditions. 6 legs supported the body as it advanced across the substrate, each step leaving a subtle imprint in the soft material below. At the rear, 2 larger appendages extended outward, shaped like paddles, capable of pushing against the water when the animal lifted itself into motion. This dual capacity allowed it to shift between grounded and suspended movement, maintaining effectiveness whether pursuing prey through open water or approaching quietly along the surface. At the front, a pair of grasping structures, known as chelicerae, projected outward. These were not simple extensions, but specialized tools capable of closing with considerable force. The structure of these appendages suggests a capacity to secure struggling prey without immediate release, maintaining a firm hold while the rest of the body adjusted position. Once engaged, the grip did not rely on speed alone, but on sustained pressure, allowing the animal to manage prey that resisted or attempted to escape. Evidence of their passage remains preserved in the sediment they once crossed. Fossil trackways reveal patterns of movement etched into ancient surfaces, lines of impressions that record the placement of each limb. Some of these traces extend over broad widths, the marks of the paddles visible alongside the impressions of the walking legs, creating a composite image of motion that unfolded slowly but with intent. These pathways offer a direct record of behavior, a moment of movement captured and held within the stone. Their sensory perception was equally adapted to their environment. Positioned high on the body, their compound eyes provided a wide field of view, allowing them to detect changes in light and motion across a broad area. In shallow waters where clarity shifted and shadows moved with the current, this arrangement offered an advantage, enabling them to respond to subtle variations in their surroundings. Their awareness extended across the space they occupied, linking movement, detection, and response into a continuous process. Over time, the presence of these animals began to change. As the Carboniferous progressed, other forms of life expanded into similar roles, bringing with them different strategies and capabilities. Jawed fish, with more efficient movement and new mechanisms for capturing prey, began to occupy the same ecological space. The shift was gradual, not abrupt, as one form slowly gave way to another through sustained competition rather than sudden loss. The final members of this lineage persisted into the early Permian, maintaining their presence even as conditions evolved around them. Eventually, they disappeared entirely, not through a single event, but through a steady reduction as other organisms proved better suited to the changing environment. Their long history came to a close, leaving behind only the impressions of their movement and the structures of their bodies preserved within the rock. What followed did not simply replace them with familiarity, but introduced forms that carried their own unusual adaptations, continuing the pattern of diversity that defined this ocean. In the slow exchange between surface and depth, there existed a group of animals carrying within their bodies the early structure of something that did not yet fully exist. They moved through the water as fish, yet parts of their form suggested a future beyond it, as though the boundary between ocean and land had already begun to soften. This period captured them in the middle of that change, preserving features that would later be refined into entirely different modes of life. Among the largest of these were the rhizodonts, predators of considerable size whose bodies extended to lengths approaching 7 meters. Their fins did not taper into thin, flexible rays as seen in later fish, but formed muscular lobes supported by internal bones. Within these lobes lay the same structural pattern that would, in distant time, give rise to limbs capable of bearing weight. In their present form, these appendages allowed controlled, powerful movement through the water, providing both propulsion and stability as the animals navigated their environment. The jaws of these predators reflected a different approach to feeding. In Rhizodus hybridi, the teeth extended into long, interlocking fangs, some reaching lengths of around 22 centimeters. These were not shaped for slicing or crushing, but for holding. Once prey was secured, it could be shaken with force or drawn inward whole, the grip maintained by the alignment of these elongated structures. The interaction was direct, relying on control rather than repeated biting, an approach suited to capturing large or struggling organisms within the same space. These lobe-finned fish existed close to the point at which vertebrate life began extending beyond the water. Their relationship to the earliest land-dwelling animals was not distant, but immediate, sharing a recent common ancestry that still showed in their anatomy. Some species retained the ability to move through shallow environments where water met exposed surfaces, capable of brief excursions beyond full submersion. The transition was not complete, but it was underway, present in the arrangement of bones and the way their bodies engaged with their surroundings. Around them, smaller fish moved in large, coordinated groups, their bodies covered in diamond-shaped scales that reflected light in shifting patterns. These paleoniscoids formed dense shoals within the midwater, their movement synchronized in a way that created flowing structures within the water itself. Their numbers provided a constant source of food for larger predators, sustaining the energy flow that moved through the system. Rapid reproduction ensured their continued presence, allowing them to recover quickly from losses and maintain their role within the environment. Alongside these forms, early ray-finned fish were present, though not yet dominant. Their fins, supported by thin rays rather than fleshy lobes, allowed a different style of movement, one that would later become widespread. During this time, they remained secondary, their diversity beginning to expand but not yet reaching the prominence seen in later oceans. Within their structure lay the foundation for a future shift, one that would eventually reshape marine life. The mechanics of feeding were evolving across these groups. Jaw structures became more efficient, supported by new arrangements of muscle that increased the force with which they could close. This allowed access to prey that had previously been difficult to capture or process, opening opportunities that earlier forms could not exploit. The change was gradual, built through small adjustments that accumulated over time, each one altering the range of interactions possible within the environment. The relationship between these fish and the surface below them was continuous. As they fed along the floor, their movement disturbed the upper layers, lifting fine material into the water and redistributing it across the surrounding area. Waste produced by these animals returned nutrients to the system, supporting the organisms anchored in place. When individuals died, their bodies descended, settling into the layers below and becoming a concentrated source of energy for those that consumed what remained. Through these interactions, fish were not separate from the environment they moved through, but part of the same system, shaping and being shaped by the conditions around them. Their presence linked the motion of the water to the structure of the ground, creating a connection that extended across every layer of this world. There is a certain kind of movement in open water that leaves no disturbance behind it, a slow adjustment of position rather than a push through space, as though the animal is held in place by balance alone. Within this suspended layer, a group of organisms moved with that quiet precision, enclosed within shells that carried both their weight and their control over it. These were the ammonoids, distant relatives of modern squid and octopus. Though unlike their living counterparts, they remained housed within tightly coiled external shells, each one divided into a sequence of internal chambers. The structure of these shells was not merely protective. It functioned as a system of regulation, allowing the animal inside to control its position in the water with remarkable accuracy. Running through the chambers was a slender tube known as the siphuncle, connecting each compartment to the body of the organism. By adjusting the balance of fluid and gas within these chambers, the ammonoid could alter its density, rising or descending, without the need for continuous motion. The water around it became a medium in which it could hover, suspended at a chosen depth with minimal effort. This method of control gave rise to a style of movement that appeared almost effortless. Instead of constant propulsion, the animal drifted, making small corrections through gentle adjustments of its tentacles. The shell itself contributed to this process, its shape influencing how the organism interacted with the surrounding water. Each curve, each ridge, altered the way currents flowed around it, creating subtle differences in stability and maneuverability. Following a period of severe reduction in their numbers at the close of the Devonian, ammonoids entered a phase of rapid expansion. In the span of a few million years, they diversified into a wide range of forms, occupying ecological spaces that had been left vacant. New species appeared with shells of varying curvature, thickness, and ornamentation, each reflecting a different adaptation to depth, movement, or feeding behavior. Their proliferation was not gradual but swift, filling the water column with a diversity that reshaped the balance of life within it. The size of these shells varied widely. Some remained small, only a few centimeters across, while others grew to diameters exceeding a meter by the time of the Permian. The internal architecture remained consistent, but the external form recorded the life of the organism. The pattern of ridges and the tightness of the coil corresponded to how it moved and where it resided, turning each shell into a physical record of its existence within the water. As these forms accumulated in the geological record, they provided a unique measure of time. Their rapid evolution and distinctive shapes allowed each species to be identified with precision, linking specific layers of rock to narrow intervals in Earth's history. A single shell could anchor a moment within a span of millions of years, offering a level of detail rarely matched by other fossils. Through them, the passage of time itself became visible, traced through changes in form and structure. Within their environment, ammonoids occupied multiple roles. Their tentacles extended outward, capturing small fish and invertebrates, drawing them inward toward a concealed mouth. At the same time, they were subject to predation, targeted by larger animals that navigated the same space. Their presence formed part of a network of interactions that connected different layers of the ecosystem, linking the open water above to the activity below. In some species, differences in size between individuals suggest variations related to reproduction. Larger shells are often interpreted as belonging to females, providing space for the development of eggs, while smaller forms may represent males. These distinctions hint at life cycles that included not only growth and feeding, but the continuation of the lineage through generations adapted to the same environment. Their existence extended far beyond the boundaries of this period. After surviving the upheaval that marked the end of the Permian, they continued to diversify, passing through multiple episodes of change that reshaped the ocean again and again. Only at the close of the Cretaceous, many millions of years later, did their lineage come to an end, concluding a span of continuous presence that stretched across vast portions of Earth's history. Nearby, within the same waters, another lineage persisted alongside them, following a different path, less varied in form but equally enduring in time. Long before many of the forms moving through this water began to diversify and change, there were others that had already settled into a pattern that required little alteration. These were the nautiloids, a lineage that had endured for more than 200 million years by the time this ocean reached its full complexity, carrying forward a design that had persisted through earlier extinctions without losing its essential structure. Their presence was not defined by variation, but by continuity, a steady refinement of a form that had proven itself across vast stretches of time. Their bodies remained enclosed within chambered shells, similar in principle to those of the ammonoids nearby, yet differing in the details that governed their function. Inside, the divisions between chambers were marked by smooth, curving boundaries rather than intricate patterns. This simplicity extended throughout their structure, reducing points of weakness and allowing the shell to maintain its integrity under changing conditions. The siphuncle still passed through these chambers, enabling control over buoyancy, but the overall arrangement emphasized stability rather than experimentation. Across this environment, nautiloids appeared in a range of shapes. Some formed tightly coiled shells, compact and balanced, while others extended into long, straight structures known as orthocones, their bodies housed within elongated chambers that projected forward through the water. These larger forms moved more slowly, often positioning themselves in deeper or quieter regions, where they could wait for passing prey rather than actively pursue it. Their feeding strategy relied on patience, extending tentacles to capture what drifted within reach, drawing it inward with measured control. The contrast between these animals and their more rapidly evolving relatives lay not in their ability to survive, but in how they approached change. Where others diversified into numerous forms, adapting quickly to shifting conditions, nautiloids maintained a consistent design, adjusting only within narrow limits. This approach did not restrict them. Instead, it allowed them to persist through transitions that removed more specialized forms, their stability becoming an advantage when the environment shifted beyond the tolerance of others. Their survival into the present day offers a direct connection to this distant world. Two species of nautilus continue to inhabit parts of the Indo-Pacific, carrying with them the same structural features, behaviors, and physiological processes that defined their ancestors. Their shells retain the same arrangement of chambers, their movement through the water follows the same principles, and their interaction with their surroundings reflects patterns established hundreds of millions of years earlier. The continuity is not approximate, but exact in its essential elements. Observing these living forms provides insight into the conditions of the past. Their rate of metabolism remains low, allowing them to function with minimal energy input, an adaptation that supports survival in environments where food is not always abundant. They can endure extended periods without feeding, maintaining their internal balance until conditions improve. This efficiency reduces their dependence on constant resource availability, allowing them to persist through fluctuations that would challenge more active organisms. Their behavior follows a steady rhythm, rising and descending through the water as light and conditions change, adjusting their position through the controlled movement of fluid within their shells. Their tentacles, lacking the strong suction seen in some modern relatives, rely on contact and grip to secure prey, reflecting a feeding strategy that emphasizes consistency over speed. Their reproductive cycles proceed slowly, producing fewer offspring but investing in their development over extended periods. When a modern nautilus shell is placed beside one preserved from this ancient ocean, the similarity is precise. The curves align, the chamber spacing matches, and the overall structure remains unchanged. It is not a resemblance shaped by coincidence, but a direct continuation of a form that required no fundamental redesign. The passage of time has not altered its essential geometry. Within this environment, the presence of such continuity stands alongside the diversity of other forms, each representing a different approach to survival. Some adapted through change, others through persistence, each finding a place within the same system. Along certain stretches of the ancient floor, where patterns of life had persisted through immense spans of time, there remained a presence that carried with it the memory of far earlier oceans. Trilobites, once among the most widespread and varied animals in marine environments, continued to inhabit this world, though their dominance had begun to recede. Their lineage extended back more than 270 million years, a duration that exceeded the entire interval between the first appearance of dinosaurs and the present day, placing them among the longest enduring forms of complex life in the history of the planet. By the time this ocean reached its mature state, their diversity had already declined. Where once thousands of species occupied nearly every available niche, only a few hundred remained, each one adapted to specific conditions that allowed it to persist as broader competition increased. These later forms were often smaller, their behaviors more refined, their presence concentrated in environments where their particular adaptations provided an advantage. Their distribution reflected a gradual narrowing of opportunity rather than a sudden loss, a slow contraction shaped by changes unfolding around them. One of their most remarkable features lay in their vision. Trilobite eyes were constructed from calcite, each lens formed from a single crystal, aligned with precision. This arrangement minimized distortion, allowing light to pass through with clarity that matched the demands of their environment. The geometry of these lenses created a visual system unlike any other, combining multiple units into a compound structure capable of detecting movement and contrast across a wide field. This approach to vision has not been repeated in any living animal, making their eyes a unique solution developed once and never again. Their bodies, segmented and articulated, allowed a range of movement across the surface, but also supported a distinctive form of defense. When threatened, some species could draw their segments inward, curling into a compact sphere. The plates of their exoskeleton interlocked, sealing the softer parts within and presenting a hardened exterior to whatever approached. Fossil clusters preserve moments where multiple individuals adopted this position simultaneously, suggesting a coordinated response to external disturbance, a shared behavior triggered by the presence of danger. As time progressed, the expansion of other groups began to intersect with the roles trilobites once filled. The rise of jawed fish introduced new forms of predation, faster and more energetically efficient, capable of exploiting resources in ways that altered the balance of the environment. The fossil record shows a clear pattern. As fish diversity increased, trilobite ranges contracted, their habitats becoming more restricted. This relationship does not reflect a single cause, but a gradual displacement as evolving forms occupied spaces that had once belonged to them. Despite this decline, trilobites persisted, maintaining their presence across changing conditions until the final transition at the end of the Permian. At that point, their long history came to a complete close. The lineage, which had endured for more than 270 million years, ended without continuation. No direct descendants remained. No surviving branch carried forward their specific design. Their disappearance marked not a transformation into something new, but a conclusion. What remains are the impressions they left behind, preserved in stone with a clarity that allows their form to be studied long after their disappearance. In well-preserved specimens, the individual lenses of their eyes can still be distinguished, each one retaining the precise arrangement that once focused light onto living tissue. These structures, now mineralized, continue to reflect the geometry of vision, a record of how these animals interacted with their surroundings. Their story unfolds within the broader pattern of life in this ocean, where some lineages expanded and others receded, each responding to the same shifting conditions. Trilobites did not vanish abruptly, but faded over time, their long presence gradually giving way to new forms that came to define the environment. Beneath every visible structure in this ancient sea, there existed a quieter layer of activity, one that did not present itself through form or movement, yet shaped the conditions that allowed all other life to exist. It unfolded at scales too small to be seen directly, spread across surfaces and within sediments, forming a foundation that supported the entire system without leaving a clear record of its presence. This was the microbial world, a network of organisms whose influence extended through every layer of the environment. Along the uppermost surface of the sediment, thin films of bacterial communities developed, spreading across available space in continuous sheets. These mats were composed of organisms capable of drawing energy either from light or from chemical reactions, depending on their position and conditions. In areas where sunlight reached the floor, photosynthetic bacteria converted light into energy, producing organic material that entered the broader food web. In darker zones, other groups relied on chemical gradients, extracting energy from compounds present within the sediment and surrounding water. Together, these communities formed a living interface between the water above and the layers below. Their presence also altered the physical stability of the surface. By binding particles together, these microbial mats reduced the movement of sediment, preventing it from being easily displaced by currents. This stabilization created a more consistent environment for the organisms that depended on fixed positions, allowing structures to persist without being disrupted. The surface became not only inhabited, but reinforced, shaped by the continuous activity of these microscopic populations. Below this layer, conditions shifted. Oxygen became limited, and different microbial processes took hold. Sulfur-reducing bacteria operated within these deeper sediments, breaking down organic material in the absence of oxygen. The byproducts of their activity included compounds that were inhospitable to many larger organisms, yet served as energy sources for other microbes adapted to these conditions. This created a vertical gradient where different communities occupied distinct layers, each performing specific chemical transformations that contributed to the overall balance. The cycling of essential elements depended on these processes. Nitrogen, required by all living organisms to build proteins, was converted into usable forms through the activity of microbial communities. Without this transformation, the nutrients necessary for growth would remain inaccessible, and the entire system would lose its capacity to sustain complex life. This cycle operated continuously, linking the atmosphere, the water, and the organisms within it through a series of chemical exchanges that remained largely invisible. From above, a constant flow of material descended, a slow accumulation of organic particles drifting downward through the water. This material, composed of the remains of microscopic life, waste products, and fragments from larger organisms, settled onto the surface in a continuous process. It provided a steady input of energy to those living below, sustaining organisms that could not access the productivity of the surface waters directly. The descent was gradual, yet uninterrupted, creating a connection between distant layers of the ocean. Once this material reached the floor, microbial decomposers began to break it down. Complex molecules were reduced to simpler forms, releasing nutrients back into the surrounding environment. This process occurred over relatively short spans of time, ensuring that little material remained unused. The products of decomposition were taken up again by other organisms, continuing the cycle of growth and transformation that defined the system. Above all of this, microscopic algae in the upper waters contributed to the broader balance. Through photosynthesis, they removed carbon from the atmosphere, incorporating it into organic material that would eventually become part of the descending flux. This activity influenced the composition of both the water and the air, supporting the conditions that allowed the dense communities below to persist. Across immense spans of time, the fundamental structure of this microbial system has remained remarkably consistent. The same types of processes continue to operate in modern oceans, performing similar roles in maintaining the balance of life. While larger organisms have changed, appeared, and disappeared, this underlying network has endured with relatively little alteration, providing continuity across hundreds of millions of years. It is within this unseen layer that the stability of the entire environment was maintained, each transformation contributing to a system that supported all visible forms without drawing attention to itself. Far beyond the reach of light, where the surface influence fades into stillness, the ocean continues downward into depths that remain largely unseen, even in the present. This deeper portion of the ancient world extended across vast regions, forming a realm that differed entirely from the shallower environments already described. Here, pressure increased, temperature fell, and the connection to sunlight disappeared, leaving behind a system that operated through processes less visible and more difficult to trace. In this environment, the record of life becomes uncertain. Organisms with hard shells or rigid structures leave clear impressions, but those composed of softer materials rarely persist after death. As a result, the community that occupied the deep floor is known primarily through indirect evidence, subtle disturbances preserved in sediment rather than the bodies that created them. These traces, though incomplete, reveal patterns of activity that suggest a complex and active ecosystem existing beyond direct observation. Burrows appear within the rock as winding passages, some shallow and branching, others extending deeper into the sediment. Their shapes vary, indicating different methods of movement and feeding. Some were likely created by organisms that consumed material within the sediment itself, processing it as they moved, while others may have used these spaces as temporary refuge. The diversity of these forms suggests the presence of multiple species interacting within the same environment, each adapted to a specific role within the system. Across these layers, impressions of movement are preserved as faint trails, lines that record the passage of organisms across the surface. These markings provide evidence of activity that cannot be directly associated with a known form, yet they confirm the presence of life moving, feeding, and interacting within this space. The absence of bodies does not indicate absence of life, but rather a limitation in what can be preserved over such spans of time. Certain organisms can be inferred with greater confidence. Holothurians, commonly known as sea cucumbers, likely inhabited these depths, feeding by consuming sediment and extracting organic material. Their modern counterparts perform similar roles, processing large volumes of material and contributing to the redistribution of nutrients. Their soft bodies, however, leave little trace, making their presence visible only through the patterns of disturbance they would have created. Polychaete worms, segmented and often active within the sediment, were also likely present in significant numbers. Their movement through the substrate would have contributed to the mixing of layers, altering the distribution of nutrients and influencing the structure of the environment. Like the Holothurians, their physical remains are rarely preserved, leaving their existence to be inferred from the patterns left behind. This deep environment also played a crucial role in regulating the broader system. As organic material descended from above, it accumulated on the floor, where it became incorporated into the sediment. Over time, this process locked carbon away, removing it from circulation and influencing the composition of the atmosphere. The deep ocean functioned as a vast reservoir, storing the remnants of life and contributing to the long-term balance of the planet's chemistry. Despite these insights, the full composition of this community remains uncertain. The available evidence provides glimpses, fragments of activity that suggest complexity, yet do not reveal the complete picture. Many organisms that lived here may have left no trace at all, their forms lost entirely to time, preserved only in the effects they had on their surroundings. This limitation highlights a broader reality. The fossil record, though detailed in many respects, captures only a portion of what once existed. Structures that resist decay are preserved, while those that do not are largely absent. The result is an incomplete representation, a reconstruction based on what endures rather than what was most abundant. Within this deeper layer, the true extent of life may have exceeded what can now be described, a diversity that remains beyond recovery. The traces that remain offer a sense of presence, but not a full account, leaving parts of this world permanently out of reach, defined as much by what cannot be known as by what can. What held this entire system together was not visible structure, but balance, a precise alignment of chemistry that allowed every layer of life to function as it did. The water itself carried the conditions that made this world possible, and those conditions, though stable across long spans, were never fixed. They shifted slowly, almost imperceptibly, and within those shifts lay the limits of the system. During this period, the ocean operated as what is known as a calcite sea, a state defined by the ratio of magnesium to calcium dissolved within it. This ratio favored the formation of calcite, a crystalline form of calcium carbonate that many organisms use to construct shells and skeletal frameworks. The availability of these ions determined which forms could build efficiently and which could not, shaping the composition of entire communities. Structures that rose from the floor, from delicate frameworks to rigid supports, all depended on this chemical balance, drawing material directly from the surrounding water. Temperature played an equally significant role. In the shallow equatorial regions where this ecosystem reached its greatest density, water temperatures remained within a range of approximately 28 to 30 degrees Celsius. This warmth supported rapid growth and high productivity. allowing organisms to develop quickly and maintain the dense populations that characterized the environment. At the same time, this range existed close to a threshold beyond which further increases could begin to disrupt the processes that sustained it. Oxygen levels in these shallow waters remained relatively high, supported by continuous mixing and the productivity of organisms above. This allowed life to occupy the floor without limitation in many areas. Yet even within this broader system, there were regions where oxygen was scarce. In deeper basins or zones with restricted circulation, water could become depleted, creating areas where most organisms could not survive. These anoxic zones marked the boundaries of the community, defining where life could persist and where it could not. Within the sediment, a record of these conditions accumulated. The ratio of different carbon isotopes preserved in marine deposits provides a measure of productivity over time. When biological activity remains high, the balance of these isotopes follows a consistent pattern. When that activity declines, the pattern shifts, revealing a change in the underlying system. Through this record, it becomes clear that the ocean maintained extraordinary productivity for millions of years, sustaining the complex structures already described. Over time, however, subtle deviations begin to appear, indicating that the balance was starting to change. One source of this change emerged from volcanic activity, particularly from regions corresponding to what is now southern China. The eruptions associated with the Ammonoid traps released large quantities of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. This increase altered the composition of both air and water, leading to a gradual warming and a shift in the chemistry of the ocean. The effects were not immediate, but they introduced a new direction to the system, one that moved away from the conditions that had previously supported stability. As carbon dioxide dissolved into seawater, it influenced the acidity of the environment. A decrease in pH made it more difficult for organisms to form and maintain calcium carbonate structures. For those that relied on calcite to build their bodies, this presented a direct challenge. Shells became harder to construct, existing structures more vulnerable to dissolution, and the processes that had once operated with ease began to require greater effort. These changes did not produce an immediate collapse. Instead, they accumulated gradually, each adjustment adding to the overall shift. The system continued to function, but with increasing strain, as the chemical foundation on which it depended moved further from its original state. Over extended periods, these incremental changes altered the balance of the environment, affecting growth rates, structural integrity, and the distribution of life. The ocean remained active, its processes ongoing, but the conditions that had once aligned so precisely were beginning to drift. What had been stable over millions of years was becoming less certain, not through sudden disruption, but through a steady progression toward a different equilibrium. There comes a point in the record where continuity breaks, not as a gradual fading, but as an abrupt thinning of presence, a boundary where what once filled every layer of the ocean gives way to absence. This moment, set at approximately 252 million years ago, marks the most extensive biological loss known in Earth's history. It does not stand out by familiarity, but by scale, a transformation that altered nearly every aspect of life in the sea. The origin of this change lay far from the waters it would reshape. In a region corresponding to present-day Siberia, vast volcanic systems began to erupt, releasing lava across an area that extended beyond the size of modern Europe. These eruptions did not occur as isolated events but continued over an extended period, lasting close to 1 million years. During this time, Immense quantities of carbon dioxide entered the atmosphere, altering the balance that had remained relatively stable for millions of years prior. As this gas accumulated, the climate responded. Ocean surface temperatures in shallow regions rose by approximately 8 to 10 degrees Celsius within a relatively brief geological interval measured in tens of thousands of years. This increase shifted conditions beyond the range that many organisms could tolerate, affecting metabolic processes, growth rates, and the stability of the structures they depended on. The warmth itself did not act alone, but initiated a cascade of additional changes. One of these changes involved the chemistry of the water. As carbon dioxide dissolved into the ocean, it lowered the pH, increasing acidity and altering the balance of carbonate ions available for shell formation. Organisms that relied on calcium carbonate to build their bodies began to experience direct effects. Structures that had once formed easily became more difficult to maintain, and in some cases, existing shells began to dissolve. The framework that supported entire communities weakened from within, no longer reinforced by the chemistry that had once sustained it. At the same time, the warming of the water reduced its capacity to hold dissolved oxygen. Circulation patterns shifted, creating layers that no longer mixed effectively. Oxygen-rich surface waters became separated from deeper regions, and without replenishment, these depths lost the conditions necessary to support most forms of life. Large areas of the ocean floor entered a state of anoxia, where oxygen was absent, and survival became impossible for organisms dependent on it. The combined effect of warming, acidification, and oxygen loss produced a collapse that extended across nearly all marine environments. Approximately 96% of marine species were eliminated. This proportion reflects not a partial reduction, but an overwhelming loss, leaving only a small fraction of the previous diversity. Entire groups disappeared, including the last of the trilobites, the blastoids, and the coral forms that had built the structural foundation of the ecosystem. Many brachiopod and crinoid lineages were lost, along with a majority of ammonoid species and numerous fish groups. The physical structure of the ocean floor changed as a result. The reefs that had once risen from the sediment, built by organisms no longer present, ceased to exist. In their absence, the complex architecture that had supported layered communities vanished, leaving a more uniform environment without the features that had defined it. This absence persisted for an extended period, lasting approximately 10 million years, during which no comparable reef systems developed anywhere on the planet. Recovery did not occur quickly. The processes that had built the previous system required time to reestablish, and the conditions that supported them had to return to a stable state. Over the same span of 10 million years, life began to diversify again, forming new communities that differed from those that had come before. The duration of this recovery exceeds that observed in other extinction events, reflecting the scale of the disruption and the depth of its impact. What remains in the geological record is a clear division, a transition from abundance to scarcity compressed into a narrow interval of rock. On one side, the dense accumulation of life that characterized this ocean. On the other, a reduced presence, marking the beginning of a different configuration that would develop over the millions of years that followed. In the quiet that followed, the ocean did not return evenly, nor did life reappear without direction. What remained was shaped by a pattern, one that can be read through the distribution of survivors and the absence of those that did not endure. The outcome was not arbitrary. It reflected a set of conditions that favored certain traits while excluding others, a selection written into the chemistry and physics of the environment itself. Organisms that depended entirely on the construction of calcium carbonate structures were among the most heavily affected. Their bodies required a constant supply of specific ions, and when the balance of the water shifted, their ability to build and maintain these forms was compromised. Shells that once formed with ease became difficult to sustain, and existing structures weakened over time. In contrast, organisms that did not rely on this process retained a degree of independence from these changes, allowing them to persist under conditions that proved destructive to others. Metabolism played a similar role. Species with high energy demands required steady access to oxygen and food, both of which became limited as the environment changed. These organisms struggled to maintain their internal processes, and their populations declined accordingly. Those with lower metabolic rates, capable of functioning with reduced input, found themselves better suited to the altered conditions. Their slower pace of life became an advantage, allowing them to continue where others could not. Among organisms occupying similar ecological positions, subtle differences proved decisive. Bivalves, for example, shared many characteristics with brachiopods, including a reliance on filtering water for nutrients. Yet bivalves possessed a greater tolerance for low oxygen conditions and a more flexible metabolic system. These differences allowed them to survive at higher rates, eventually taking on roles that had previously been held by their counterparts. The distinction between survival and disappearance rested on these underlying traits rather than on outward similarity. Mobility within the water column also influenced survival. Nautiloids, with their ability to regulate buoyancy and move between depths, were able to access cooler, more oxygenated regions when surface conditions became unfavorable. Ammonoids, though more heavily impacted, retained some capacity for adjustment, allowing a portion of their lineage to continue. The ability to shift position within the vertical structure of the ocean provided access to environments that remained habitable when others did not. Size emerged as another factor. Smaller organisms, requiring fewer resources and less oxygen, were more likely to endure. Larger species, with greater demands, experienced higher rates of loss. This pattern, repeated across multiple groups, indicating that the scale of an organism's body influenced its capacity to withstand the changes occurring around it. Reduction in size corresponded with increased resilience under constrained conditions. The absence of rigid skeletal structures offered an additional advantage. Organisms composed primarily of soft tissues were less affected by changes in water chemistry that interfered with mineral formation. Without the need to maintain calcified components, they avoided one of the primary pressures acting on the system. This allowed certain groups of worms, arthropods, and soft-bodied predators to persist in environments where others declined. Location also played a role in determining outcomes. Regions where colder, oxygen-rich water moved upward from deeper layers provided localized conditions that supported survival. These areas acted as pockets of stability within a broader system, undergoing change, allowing communities to persist where others could not. The distribution of these regions influenced which populations endured and which were lost. The result of these combined factors was a reshaping of the ocean's biological structure. The survivors did not inherit a diminished version of the previous world, but entered an environment where many roles remained unfilled. With fewer competitors and open ecological space, they expanded into new positions, altering the composition of the system as it reformed. Over time, this process gave rise to a different arrangement of life, one built from the characteristics that had allowed survival under the most challenging conditions. Where once the floor had been shaped by familiar structures, The returning ocean assembled itself with unfamiliar priorities, as if the memory of the earlier world had been set aside rather than restored. The patterns of growth, the arrangement of life, even the materials used to construct the seafloor community carried a different tone, subtle at first, then unmistakable. The continuity of the ocean remained, but the identity of its inhabitants had shifted into something new. Across the recovering seabed, bivalves spread into spaces that had long been occupied by others. Clams, oysters, and mussels anchored themselves into sediment and rock, their paired shells opening and closing in quiet rhythm with the passing water. Before the collapse, they had existed in the margins, present but restrained by competition. Now, with those constraints removed, they multiplied and diversified, occupying a wide range of environments and gradually defining the character of the seafloor. Their tolerance for changing conditions and their flexible physiology allowed them to persist where more specialized forms could not, and this adaptability became the foundation of their rise. In the spaces where reefs began to return, the builders were not the same. The corals that had once shaped the underwater architecture did not reappear. In their place, a different lineage emerged, constructing similar frameworks through entirely separate biological pathways. These new corals, known as scleractinians, secreted skeletons that rose into branching and layered forms, assembling habitats that echoed earlier structures without inheriting them. The resemblance was functional rather than ancestral, an example of convergent development unfolding not just in isolated species, but across entire systems. The ocean had found a way to rebuild complexity using different components, guided by similar constraints but arriving at a distinct solution. Among the sediments, echinoids expanded into roles that had been left vacant. Sea urchins moved across the floor, grazing and burrowing, their spines interacting with the substrate in ways that reshaped its texture and composition. Their presence altered the distribution of organic material, influencing which organisms could settle and which could not. As they diversified, they introduced new patterns of interaction, contributing to a restructuring of the benthic environment that differed from what had come before. In the water above, a quiet shift in dominance unfolded. Ray-finned fish, once secondary participants in earlier communities, began to occupy a broader range of ecological roles. Their body structures allowed for varied modes of movement, feeding, and adaptation, and over time, they extended into niches that had previously been inaccessible. This expansion marked the beginning of a long trajectory, one that would eventually lead to the diversity seen in modern oceans. Their rise was not sudden, but it was steady, shaped by the absence of earlier competitors and the availability of open ecological space. The absence itself played a defining role. With many established groups gone, the constraints that had once limited diversification were lifted. New forms could emerge and persist without immediate competition, allowing evolutionary pathways to unfold with fewer restrictions. This period of openness did not produce randomness, but rather a reorganization guided by the same underlying principles that had structured earlier ecosystems. Resources were still partitioned, energy still flowed through interconnected systems, and space was still filled wherever it could support life. The resulting ocean was not a continuation of what had been lost. It was a reconstruction built from different materials and inhabited by different organisms, yet organized according to familiar patterns of interaction and balance. The shapes of reefs, the layering of communities, and the exchange of energy between organisms all returned in altered forms, reflecting both continuity and change. Over time, this new arrangement stabilized, forming the basis for the marine ecosystems that would follow. In this way, the ocean did not simply recover. It transformed, carrying forward the logic of life while redefining the structures through which that logic was expressed. Long after the water withdrew and the continents shifted, the memory of that ocean settled into layers, each one a quiet record of what once moved above it. What remains is not a single archive but a scattered library of stone, lifted by slow tectonic motion and exposed to air, where fragments of an ancient seabed can be read with careful attention. Every detail of that lost world comes from these deposits, shaped in place and then carried upward over spans of time too long to perceive directly. In certain regions, preservation reached an unusual level of completeness. The Bear Gulch limestone, now exposed in what is called Montana, contains impressions that extend beyond hard parts into the delicate structures rarely seen in fossils. Muscles, skin surfaces, even the outlines of internal organs appear as faint but precise markings held within fine sediment that once settled in calm water. These impressions reveal not only the existence of organisms but their physical arrangement, allowing a closer reconstruction of how they functioned in life. Further east, within deposits known as Mason Creek in what is now Illinois, a different form of preservation occurs. Organisms became sealed within nodules of iron carbonate, forming compact capsules that protected their structure from decay. When these nodules are opened, they sometimes reveal complete organisms preserved in three-dimensional relief, as if time had paused at the moment of burial. The surrounding matrix records the conditions of a river delta meeting the sea, capturing both marine and terrestrial life within the same system. The shells of marine organisms carry another layer of information, one that is not immediately visible. Within their mineral structure, subtle variations in oxygen isotopes reflect the temperature of the water during growth. By measuring these ratios along successive layers of a single shell, it becomes possible to reconstruct seasonal changes, tracing fluctuations in temperature across the lifespan of an individual organism. The shell becomes a timeline, recording environmental conditions with a resolution that approaches the rhythm of years. Among the smallest fossils, conodont elements appear in remarkable abundance. These tiny, tooth-like structures belong to eel-shaped animals and are distributed widely through marine sediments of this age. Their forms changed rapidly through time, and each distinct shape corresponds to a narrow interval in the geological record. Because of this, their presence allows precise dating of sediment layers, providing a framework that connects distant outcrops into a coherent sequence. Modern techniques have extended this process of reading stone into dimensions that were once inaccessible. Synchrotron imaging uses high-energy radiation to pass through fossils without damaging them, revealing internal structures that remain hidden within rock. Muscle attachment sites, growth patterns, and the arrangement of internal features can be visualized in detail, offering insights that traditional preparation could not provide. The fossil remains intact, yet its internal story becomes visible. At certain locations, the transition marking the end of this world appears as a narrow boundary within the rock itself. On one side, layers are dense with the remains of organisms, each surface carrying the imprint of a populated environment. On the other side, the same layers become sparse, the variety of forms reduced, the presence of life diminished to scattered traces. In some outcrops, this shift occurs within a thickness no greater than a small fraction of a hand's breadth, a physical boundary separating two profoundly different conditions. New discoveries continue to emerge from sites spread across multiple regions, including areas now called China, Morocco, and the American Southwest. Each excavation adds detail, sometimes extending known ranges of species, sometimes revealing entirely new forms that adjust the broader picture. The record remains incomplete, not because the information is absent, but because it is still being uncovered, layer by layer. Through all of this, the stone retains a quiet consistency. It does not interpret or explain, it preserves. What is known of that ancient ocean comes from careful reading of these preserved traces, assembled into a narrative that continues to refine itself as new evidence appears, always grounded in the physical record left behind. Far from the shoreline, where no trace of forest or river can be seen, the water still carried the quiet influence of land, as if distant continents were present in every current and every dissolved particle. The ocean did not exist apart from what lay above sea level. It responded constantly, absorbing signals from soil, atmosphere, and vegetation, translating them into changes that shaped life along the seafloor. Across the land, immense forests spread over low, humid terrain, their growth extending across vast regions. When these forests lived and died, their remains did not fully return to the atmosphere. Instead, they were buried within sediments, gradually forming layers of coal that locked away carbon for long spans of time. This process altered the composition of the air itself, drawing down carbon dioxide and shifting the balance of gases surrounding the planet. The cooling that followed was not abrupt, but it accumulated, gradually influencing global temperatures and the formation of ice across high-latitude regions. As ice expanded and contracted, the level of the ocean responded. Water locked within glaciers lowered the sea, exposing wide areas of shallow seabed to the air. These exposed regions, once submerged and filled with life, became dry ground for a time, interrupting the continuity of the communities that had occupied them. When the climate shifted again and the ice retreated, the ocean returned, flooding these areas once more. Each cycle of retreat and return created conditions that reshaped the seafloor, removing some organisms and allowing others to establish themselves in the newly submerged environment. Rivers played a continuous role in this exchange. Flowing from the land into the sea, they carried dissolved minerals, nutrients, and fine sediments, linking terrestrial processes directly to marine productivity. Phosphorus and nitrogen, released through the breakdown of rock and organic material, entered coastal waters where they supported the growth of microscopic life. These microorganisms formed the base of a broader network, sustaining larger organisms and contributing to the overall density of life within the system. The movement of these materials was steady and persistent, forming a chemical connection that never ceased. At the boundary where water met land, the influence of the atmosphere also became evident. Oxygen, produced by terrestrial vegetation, entered the ocean, dissolving into surface waters and spreading through shallow regions. This enrichment supported organisms that depended on oxygen for metabolism, reinforcing the productivity of the benthic communities below. The exchange moved in both directions, as gases released from the ocean returned to the air, maintaining a balance that linked the two realms. As conditions began to change, the connection between land and sea carried those changes in both directions. When warming altered the stability of the forests, the carbon that had been stored within their remains began to re-enter the atmosphere. This release intensified the warming trend, influencing ocean temperatures and the chemical state of seawater. The effects were not confined to a single environment. They moved across the entire system, reinforcing one another through a series of feedbacks that extended from forest soil to ocean depth. The cycles that had once supported diversity and renewal became less stable, Sea levels continued to fluctuate, but the underlying conditions no longer returned to their earlier balance. Nutrient flows shifted, atmospheric composition changed, and the interactions that had sustained both land and ocean began to weaken. What had once functioned as a coordinated system gradually lost its equilibrium. In this way, the land and the ocean were never separate narratives. They formed a single connected system, each shaping the other through continuous exchange. The rise and fall of forests influenced the chemistry of the sea, and the state of the ocean reflected those changes in turn. When the balance shifted beyond recovery, the consequences unfolded across both domains together, linking the fate of terrestrial and marine life within the same unfolding process. In the quiet surfaces of cities and villages, far from any visible shoreline, the remains of that ocean persist in plain view, shaped into walls, pavements, and carved facades that rarely reveal their origin at a glance. What appears as uniform stone is often a dense accumulation of ancient life, compressed and lithified over immense spans of time, then lifted and cut into blocks that now form the fabric of human architecture. The limestone used in many older structures is not an abstract material. It is a direct product of biological accumulation, formed from the skeletal remains of organisms that once occupied shallow marine environments. Brachiopod shells, fragments of crinoid stems, the lattice structures of bryozoans, and the frameworks of long vanished corals are all preserved within it. These components settled, broke apart, and were compacted into sediment, eventually transforming into rock through pressure and chemical change. When quarried, the resulting stone retains traces of this origin, patterns, and textures that reflect the organisms from which it formed. In regions such as the Cotswold Hills in England, or the limestone landscapes of the Burren in Ireland, the ground itself reveals these origins. Exposed surfaces display fossil fragments embedded within the rock, sometimes subtle, sometimes striking, depending on the angle of light and the degree of preservation. Similar material has been used extensively in construction, including in cities like Paris, where entire districts are built from stone that began as marine sediment. The connection between these places and the ancient ocean is continuous, though often unrecognized. Across parts of the American Midwest, thick sequences of this same limestone lie just beneath the surface. Road cuts created for highways expose layers rich with fossil material, where the density of preserved organisms can be seen clearly. In these exposures, the arrangement of shells and skeletal fragments reflects the original structure of the seafloor, offering a direct glimpse into the composition of those communities. Such sites are accessible, not confined to specialized institutions, allowing observation by anyone who knows what to look for. Contact with this material carries a particular significance. A hand placed against a limestone wall in an older building rests upon the compacted remains of organisms that lived hundreds of millions of years ago. The stone does not separate past from present. It preserves a continuity of material, linking modern environments with those distant conditions through the physical substance of the rock itself. The connection extends beyond stone. The coal that fueled early industrial development formed from the remains of terrestrial vegetation that once grew along the margins of these ancient seas. The carbon fixed by those forests became buried and transformed, later released as energy that powered large-scale technological change. In this way, the ocean and the industrial world are linked through shared chemical history, each influencing the other across deep time. The study of these materials has not been limited to formal institutions. Many important specimens have been found and documented by individuals working outside professional settings, contributing to the broader understanding of this period. Collections assembled through personal effort have added detail to the fossil record, sometimes revealing species or structures that had not been previously recognized. With prolonged attention, these fragments begin to form a coherent image. The distribution of fossils within the stone suggests relationships, patterns of growth, and interactions between organisms. Over time, these observations accumulate, allowing a mental reconstruction of the environment from which they came. The stone itself remains unchanged, but the understanding of what it represents becomes more detailed, assembling a picture of a living system that once existed and is now preserved within the material that surrounds us. At the level of individual bodies, time moved in quiet repetitions, patterns unfolding, not in dramatic events, but in cycles so consistent they became part of the structure of life itself. The ocean did not simply hold organisms. It governed them through rhythms that returned again and again, shaping when they fed, when they grew, and when they released the next generation into the water. Across the seafloor, many of the organisms followed a shared strategy for reproduction. At particular moments, triggered by subtle combinations of environmental signals, entire populations released their reproductive cells into the surrounding water. These events were not random. They were synchronized, guided by shifts in temperature, changes in light, or the steady influence of lunar cycles. The water filled with suspended life, vast clouds of eggs and sperm drifting together, increasing the likelihood of successful fertilization. For a brief period, the ocean carried not only established communities, but also the earliest stages of the next. The larvae that formed from these events did not settle without direction. Suspended in the water column, they responded to chemical cues that guided them towards suitable environments. The composition of the substrate, the presence of microbial films, and the chemical signatures of established communities all influenced where they would attach and begin growth. This process, known as chemosensory settlement, allowed even small drifting organisms to locate appropriate habitats with remarkable precision, ensuring that each new generation occupied spaces where survival was possible. Within the shells and skeletal structures of these organisms, the passage of time was recorded in fine detail. Growth occurred in layers, each increment reflecting the conditions present during its formation. In brachiopods and corals, these layers formed patterns that could be read as annual cycles, with variations corresponding to seasonal changes in the environment. Some individuals lived for decades, their shells preserving a sequence of years that documented fluctuations in temperature and resource availability. Others followed a different strategy, growing rapidly, reproducing once, and then dying within a short span. This approach, known as semiparity, concentrated reproductive effort into a single event, contrasting with species that reproduced repeatedly over longer lives. The surrounding environment exhibited its own cycles. Temperature variations across the year, though less extreme than in some modern settings, were still present and measurable. These changes influenced metabolic rates, growth patterns, and reproductive timing, creating a synchrony between the organisms and the conditions they inhabited. Warmer periods supported faster growth and increased activity, while cooler intervals slowed these processes, establishing a rhythm that repeated with each passing cycle. Differences between individuals within the same species also reflected reproductive roles. In certain ammonoids, variations in shell size corresponded to distinct biological functions, with larger individuals interpreted as females carrying greater reproductive capacity. These differences, preserved in the fossil record, provide insight into the structure of populations and the strategies that sustained them. Within this dense system, the transition from life to death was immediate and integrated. Organisms that died did not remain as isolated remains for long. Their bodies were consumed, broken down, or incorporated into the surrounding sediment, returning their material to the system in a continuous process of recycling. Nutrients released through decomposition became available to other organisms, maintaining the flow of energy through the community. The seafloor functioned as a closed loop, where loss in one part contributed directly to growth in another. These patterns, taken together, reveal a system organized with precision. Each organism operated within a framework defined by timing, chemistry, and interaction, its life cycle aligned with broader environmental rhythms. The stability of this arrangement depended on the consistency of those underlying conditions. When the chemistry or temperature of the ocean shifted beyond certain limits, the rhythms that had guided life for so long could no longer hold, and the balance they maintained began to unravel. In the layers that follow the boundary, there is an absence that feels less like emptiness and more like a discontinuity, as if entire ways of being had been set aside rather than transformed. The forms that once defined the structure of that earlier ocean do not reappear in altered versions. They do not gradually change into something new. They simply stop, leaving behind only the records of their presence. Among the most prominent of these were the rugose corals. For a span exceeding 200 million years, they constructed reef systems across wide regions, shaping habitats that supported entire communities. Their skeletons grew in solitary cones or clustered forms, contributing to the architecture of the seafloor in ways that persisted through long intervals of stability. When conditions shifted beyond their tolerance, they disappeared entirely. The corals that later built reefs arose from different lineages, sharing a similar role but not a shared ancestry. Alongside them, tabulate corals followed a parallel path. Their colonies formed intricate networks, each individual contributing to a larger structure that expanded across the substrate. Like the rugose forms, they endured for immense spans of time, yet left no continuation. Their disappearance was complete, and no living organism can be traced directly back to their lineage. Blastoids once occupied the reef floor in large numbers, their bodies arranged in precise geometric patterns that reflected both symmetry and function. For roughly 150 million years, they were a consistent presence, contributing to the density and complexity of the benthic environment. Their extinction removed not only a group of organisms, but an entire structural element from the ecosystem, leaving no descendants to carry their form forward. Trilobites, whose history extended across more than 270 million years, represent another lineage that ended without continuation. Their calcite-based visual systems, unique in their construction, allowed them to perceive their environment with a precision unmatched by any other known organism. Their disappearance marked the end of a long and varied evolutionary history, one that left no direct successor. Eurypterids, once dominant predators within their environments, also concluded their lineage without continuation. Their body structures, adapted for movement across the seafloor and through the water, combined sensory and mechanical capabilities suited to their ecological roles. Despite their long persistence and success, they did not transition into later forms. Their presence in the record ends, leaving only the traces of their existence. Certain shark lineages from this period display similarly unique adaptations that did not persist. Forms with spiral tooth arrangements or extended cutting structures represent configurations not repeated in later evolution. These designs were effective within their specific contexts, functioning successfully for extended durations. Their absence in subsequent periods reflects not a lack of viability in general, but a loss of the conditions that supported them. The pattern that emerges from these endings is consistent. These organisms were not marginal or unsuccessful. They existed for spans that exceed many groups considered successful in later periods. Their disappearance correlates with changes in environmental conditions rather than direct competition alone. When the chemical and physical framework that supported them shifted, their continued existence became impossible. Taken together, these losses indicate that the earlier ocean was not a preliminary stage leading directly to the present. It was a complete system, internally coherent and stable under its own conditions. The forms within it were suited to that system, not to a future state that would emerge after its collapse. What remains in the present ocean represents a different configuration, assembled from lineages that survived and adapted under altered conditions. The earlier system does not persist within it as a direct ancestor. Instead, it exists as a separate expression of biological possibility, preserved in stone as a record of a world that functioned fully within its own parameters and then concluded without continuation. It begins with an attempt to measure, to place that distant ocean somewhere within a scale that feels familiar. Yet every comparison stretches beyond the limits of ordinary sense. Time at that magnitude does not move like memory or history. It accumulates silently, layer upon layer, until it becomes something that cannot be held all at once, only approached in fragments that hint at its extent. Imagine reducing each year to a thickness so small it can be traced along a surface, each increment identical, each one marking the passage of a single orbit. Extend that line outward, steadily, without interruption, and it continues far beyond the distances most people travel in their lives. By the time it reaches the span required to represent that ancient ocean, the line has crossed landscapes, cities, and boundaries, becoming less a measure and more a journey. In contrast, everything recorded in human history would occupy a space so narrow it would be almost invisible, a brief marking at the very end of a vast continuum. The geography of the planet itself offers another way to sense this distance. The ocean that dominates modern maps, the one often imagined when thinking of the sea, did not exist during that earlier period. Its formation began long after the communities described here had already lived and disappeared. The absence of such a familiar feature suggests how different the arrangement of the planet once was, how the shapes of continents and basins have shifted across intervals that extend far beyond ordinary experience. Certain lineages from that earlier time illustrate this scale in a different way. Some existed for durations that exceed the span, separating their disappearance from the present moment. Their presence extended across vast stretches of geological history, persisting through changes that would later erase them entirely. When compared to these durations, the existence of modern humans occupies a narrow interval, a fraction so small that it resists intuitive understanding. Condensing this interval into a single continuous sequence provides another perspective. If the entire duration from that ocean to the present were represented as a long unfolding event, the portion corresponding to human presence would occur only at the very end, lasting for a brief moment before the sequence concludes. The overwhelming majority of the timeline would pass without any human observation, defined instead by processes and forms that existed independently of any witness. There is also a continuity that runs through all of this, less visible but equally significant. The ocean itself has persisted across these spans, not as a static body, but as a system in constant motion. Water cycles through evaporation, condensation, and flow, moving between atmosphere, land, and sea. The molecules that compose that earlier ocean have not vanished. They have been redistributed, passing through countless forms and states, carrying within them traces of past interactions. In this sense, the present ocean is connected to its earlier form not by direct continuity of structure, but by the persistence of its material and its processes. Elements of that ancient system remain embedded within the present. The carbon that once circulated through its ecosystems now exists in the atmosphere, in sediment, and in the structures built from those materials. Biological strategies that emerged during that time continue in altered forms, integrated into the functioning of modern organisms. The influence of that earlier world extends forward, not as a preserved environment, but as a set of contributions woven into subsequent systems. Considering this scale does not diminish the present moment. Instead, it places it within a broader context, revealing that the current arrangement of life and environment is one configuration among many that have existed. The conditions that define the present are neither permanent nor inevitable. They represent a phase within an ongoing process, shaped by factors that have shifted before and will continue to change, extending beyond the limits of immediate perception. It is possible to read the end of that earlier ocean not as a distant event, but as a pattern written in slow motion, one that unfolded through forces that still exist, still operate, and still follow the same physical rules. The language of that pattern is chemical, expressed in ratios, temperatures, and concentrations that can be measured long after the living system itself has vanished. The shift began with carbon entering the atmosphere in quantities large enough to alter the balance that had been maintained for millions of years. As that carbon accumulated, it changed the way heat was retained, raising temperatures across the surface waters where most life depended on stable conditions. The ocean responded not as a passive basin, but as an active system, absorbing that carbon, redistributing it, and in doing so, altering its own internal chemistry in ways that reached every level of the ecosystem. When carbon dioxide dissolves into seawater, it forms carbonic acid, a reaction simple in its mechanism yet far-reaching in its consequences. The result is a gradual lowering of pH, a shift that affects the availability of carbonate ions, the building blocks required by organisms that construct shells and skeletal frameworks. In that earlier world, those structures formed the physical foundation of the entire community. As the chemistry shifted, the cost of maintaining those structures increased, not as an immediate collapse, but as a steady pressure applied over extended time. Temperature amplified these effects. Warmer water holds less dissolved oxygen, and as temperatures rose, the capacity of the ocean to support high-energy life diminished. At the same time, stratification intensified, separating surface waters from deeper layers and reducing the exchange that normally replenishes oxygen at depth. Regions that had once supported dense communities became inhospitable, not through a single catastrophic event, but through a gradual loss of the conditions required for sustained life. What makes this sequence significant is not only the outcome, but the pathway by which it unfolded. Each step followed directly from the previous one, governed by physical and chemical relationships that remain unchanged. Carbon enters the system, temperature rises, acidity increases, oxygen availability declines. The sequence is not dependent on a specific time or place. It is a response built into the structure of the ocean itself. In the present, These same variables are being measured with increasing precision. Atmospheric carbon concentrations are rising, driven by processes that release stored carbon back into circulation. The rate of that increase exceeds what is inferred from the geological record of that earlier event, compressing changes that once unfolded over extended intervals into a much shorter span. The ocean continues to absorb a significant portion of this carbon, and with it, the same chemical reactions proceed, lowering pH and altering the balance upon which many organisms depend. The sensitivity of modern calcifying organisms provides a direct point of comparison. Reef-building corals, along with numerous shell-forming species, respond to relatively small shifts in temperature and acidity. Their structures weaken, their growth slows, and in some cases, they fail entirely to maintain the frameworks that support entire ecosystems. These responses are not speculative. They are observed, recorded, and consistent with the underlying chemistry that governed the earlier collapse. The fossil record does not function as a forecast. It does not assign outcomes to the present or define a predetermined trajectory. Instead, it offers a record of how a complex system responded under a specific set of conditions. When similar conditions arise, the responses observed in that record provide a reference, a way to interpret ongoing changes within a broader context. There is a clarity in that perspective. The ocean has persisted through immense spans of time, reorganizing itself after disruptions that removed vast portions of its living structure. Its resilience is evident, but so are the boundaries within which that resilience operates. When certain thresholds are crossed, the system does not remain unchanged. It shifts, sometimes gradually, sometimes abruptly, into a different state. The earlier ocean did not disappear entirely. Its continuity carried forward through transformation, through loss and renewal, eventually producing the systems that exist today. Yet the interval between those states was not brief. It extended across durations that, when measured against human timescales, approach incomprehensibility. Seen in this way, the record preserved in stone becomes less a distant narrative and more a reflection, not of inevitability, but of possibility, grounded in processes that continue to shape the present ocean in real time. In quiet storage rooms far from any shoreline, drawers continue to open onto a world that is not finished revealing itself, a record that appears complete at a distance, yet resolves into uncertainty when examined closely. Labels written decades apart sit side by side, each attached to specimens that have outlived the assumptions first used to describe them, their meanings shifting as new methods are brought to bear on old stone. What once seemed fully understood has begun to change under closer inspection. Species described from fragmentary remains are being reclassified as more complete material emerges, sometimes combining what were thought to be separate organisms, sometimes dividing a single form into several distinct lineages. This ongoing revision is not correction in a simple sense, but refinement, a gradual sharpening of a picture that becomes more detailed while also revealing how much remains unresolved. There are entire communities that remain largely absent, not because they were rare, but because their bodies were never built to endure. The deeper parts of that ocean, already distant in life, are distant in the record as well, preserved only through indirect traces that suggest movement, feeding, and presence without ever showing the organism itself. The shapes of burrows, the patterns of disturbed sediment, the faint impressions of paths across the seafloor. These are the only surviving signatures of a population that may have rivaled or exceeded the visible communities above. What those organisms looked like, how they interacted, and how diverse they truly were may remain beyond reconstruction. At the same time, the boundary of what can be recovered is slowly shifting. Techniques that were not available even a few decades ago are now capable of extracting information from fossils once considered silent. The chemistry locked within mineralized tissue can reveal aspects of physiology, growth, and environment with increasing precision. There is growing interest in the possibility that traces of ancient proteins, preserved under exceptional conditions, might extend further back in time than previously thought. The limits of that preservation are not yet fully defined, leaving open the question of how much biological detail might still be recoverable from specimens that appear, at first glance, to be nothing more than stone. Even among the most familiar organisms of this ecosystem, uncertainties remain. Certain lineages persisted through long spans of environmental change and then disappeared without leaving a clear cause. Their extinction does not align neatly with a single event or threshold, suggesting interactions and pressures that are only partially understood. The absence of a clear explanation is not an oversight, but a reflection of the complexity of the system in which they existed. Geography, too, continues to shift as new discoveries expand the known distribution of species. Fossil assemblages from regions once considered isolated are revealing unexpected similarities, implying connections across ancient ocean basins that are still being reconstructed. These findings feed into increasingly detailed models of ocean circulation, temperature gradients, and nutrient flows, allowing researchers to test where similar conditions might have existed and where undiscovered sites may still lie buried. The most advanced of these models do not replace the fossil record, but work alongside it, offering predictions that can be confirmed or revised as new evidence is found. In this way, the process becomes iterative, each discovery informing the next, each refinement opening further questions rather than closing them. There is a particular humility that emerges from this ongoing work. The record preserved in rock is extensive, yet it is incomplete by its very nature, shaped by processes that favor certain forms of preservation while erasing others entirely. What remains is both rich and fragmentary, detailed and partial at the same time. The study of this ocean continues not as a completed account, but as an active reading, a text that reveals more with each pass while retaining passages that resist interpretation. The scientists working within it move forward, not toward a final answer, but toward a deeper understanding of a system that, even now, holds more than it has yet given. Along a cut of exposed rock, where layers lie stacked like pages pressed flat, there is a narrow band that interrupts the continuity. A seam so thin it can be overlooked at first glance, yet it marks a division more absolute than any visible fracture. This is the boundary between worlds, a line carried across continents, formed not in a single place but written simultaneously into sediments across the planet. In some exposures, it is scarcely thicker than a fingernail. Beneath it, the record is dense, crowded with the remains of organisms that once filled every available surface, each layer containing the accumulated presence of a system that had refined itself over immense spans of time. Above it, the rock opens into intervals where life becomes sparse, where the continuity of that earlier complexity breaks and does not immediately return. The transition is not gradual in the stone. It is abrupt, compressed into a thickness that seems too slight to contain what it represents. What disappears at that boundary does not return in its original form. The structures that once defined the seafloor, the frameworks that rose upward and shaped the movement of water and the distribution of life, are no longer present in the layers that follow. The lineages that built them, that occupied them, that depended on them, end without continuation. Their absence is not partial, it is complete. Yet what follows is not empty in a permanent sense. The system reorganizes, slowly at first, then with increasing complexity, assembling a new arrangement from the remnants that remained. The forms are different, the relationships altered, but certain patterns persist beneath the surface of change. Functions that were once performed by one group are taken up by another. The positions within the system remain, even as the occupants are replaced. The inheritance of that earlier world is therefore not carried in direct lineage alone, but in the persistence of solutions to recurring constraints. The need to capture suspended particles from moving water, the need to regulate position within the water column, the need to construct protective structures from available minerals. These challenges did not disappear with the organisms that first addressed them. They continued, and with them, the strategies that proved effective were rediscovered, reshaped, and re-implemented by different forms. Fragments of that inheritance are embedded in the physical materials that surround the present. The stone used in construction, cut and shaped into walls and pathways, is composed of the accumulated remains of organisms that lived within that earlier system. The carbon stored in buried plant matter, later released and transformed into energy that drove industrial processes, originates from the same interval, linking the biological productivity of that time to the technological development of a much later one. There are also continuities that are more direct. Certain lineages persisted through the transition, carrying forward structural designs that required little alteration. Their presence in modern oceans provides a living reference, a continuity that bridges the gap between that earlier system and the present one. In their form and function, they retain aspects of a world that is otherwise accessible only through stone. The ocean itself remains the most consistent element in this continuity. Its water circulates through cycles that extend across vast spans of time, its physical properties governed by the same principles that shaped the earlier system. While its composition has shifted and its inhabitants have changed, the underlying processes remain, creating conditions within which new arrangements can emerge. What was lost is not recoverable in its original form. The specific combination of organisms, structures, and conditions that defined that earlier ocean existed only once. But what remains is not insignificant. It is present in the materials, in the surviving lineages, in the recurring patterns of ecological organization, and in the continuity of the ocean itself. The boundary in the rock marks an ending, but it also marks the point from which the present system begins to take shape, carrying within it traces of what came before, not as a direct continuation, but as an inheritance distributed across form, function, and the enduring framework of the sea itself. There is a stillness that follows the closing of a lineage, not an absence that can be measured in a single moment, but a quiet subtraction from the world, as if a particular way of being has withdrawn without leaving a direct replacement behind. It is not the same as the end of an individual life, which is expected and repeated, folded into the continuity of reproduction and renewal. This is a different kind of ending, one that removes an entire pattern from the fabric of existence. In that earlier ocean, every organism moved within its own narrow interval of time, unaware of the boundary that would eventually define its existence. A creature settling onto the seafloor, extending feeding structures into the current, was participating in a system that felt stable and continuous, its rhythms repeating across generations with no indication that the sequence would ever be interrupted. Yet from the perspective of deep time, each of those lives belonged to a configuration that would not persist. When such a configuration ends, what disappears is not only the organisms themselves, but the relationships that connected them, the interactions that gave shape to the system as a whole. The precise arrangement of predator and prey, of structure and movement, of growth and decay, is dissolved, leaving no direct continuation. The forms may have endured for immense spans, refining themselves through gradual change, but their final boundary is absolute. And yet, the processes that gave rise to those forms do not vanish with them. The impulses that guided behavior, the chemical pathways that enabled growth, the physical constraints that shaped structure, all remain embedded in the broader continuity of life. They persist not as identical expressions, but as underlying principles that can be realized again in different ways, under different conditions. There is a particular interval following that great transition when the record reflects a quieting, a reduction in the visible complexity that had once filled the ocean. The environment itself continues, the water moving, the chemistry cycling, the physical framework intact, but the abundance of life that once occupied every surface is markedly diminished. It is not an absence of the ocean, but an absence within it, a thinning of presence that extends across a span of time far beyond ordinary human reference. From that reduced state, complexity returns. It does not rebuild the previous arrangement, nor does it attempt to restore what has been lost. Instead, it assembles a new system, drawing from the survivors, from the possibilities that remained viable under altered conditions. The result is not a recovery in the sense of restoration, but a continuation through transformation, a different configuration arising from the same fundamental processes. What ended, then, was not life itself, but a particular expression of it, one that had achieved a high degree of organization and integration before its conclusion. Its disappearance does not render it incomplete. It existed fully within its own span, operating according to the conditions that sustained it, contributing to the ongoing development of the system even as it approached its limit. The persistence that follows is not the preservation of form, but the continuation of function and possibility. Materials remain, structures are repurposed, and the underlying logic of interaction carries forward into new arrangements. What appears as an ending from one perspective can be understood as a transition when viewed within the larger continuity of the planet. In this sense, the silence that follows is not empty, but transitional, a space in which the conditions for new complexity are gradually re-established. The ocean continues to move, to exchange, to support, even when the visible expression of life is reduced. Over time, that capacity is realized again, not as a repetition, but as a variation. The earlier world does not return, but it does not vanish without trace. Its influence is distributed, carried forward in altered forms, embedded in the systems that follow. The distinction between ending and persistence becomes less defined when viewed across such spans, each informing the other, each part of a continuous unfolding that extends beyond any single configuration. Far below the reach of light, where the last trace of surface movement has long since faded into stillness, the floor of the ocean continues to receive a slow, constant descent of material from above, a quiet accumulation that has never fully ceased. The basins that hold this water have shifted across the surface of the planet, opening and closing, drifting apart and colliding, yet the environment they define remains continuous, a space governed by the same pressure, the same darkness, and the same unbroken exchange between life above and sediment below. The organisms that inhabit this depth move through roles that are familiar in their function, even as their forms differ from those that once occupied similar positions. Soft-bodied deposit feeders pass across the sediment, drawing in particles and extracting what little energy remains within them, leaving behind process trails that reshape the surface in subtle ways. Burrowing worms extend through the substrate, their movements ventilating layers that would otherwise remain sealed, creating pathways through which oxygen and nutrients can circulate. Brittle stars spread their arms across the floor, gathering organic fragments from the current, each motion part of a system that remains active despite the absence of light. Among these communities, there are still forms that carry a more direct continuity. Crinoids, though reduced in diversity and often confined to colder and deeper regions, extend their feathered arms into the passing water, their tube feet coated with mucus that captures drifting particles in the same manner as their distant predecessors. Their structure, their feeding mechanism, and their position within the ecosystem reflect a design that has persisted, altered in scale and distribution, yet recognizable across immense spans of time. Elsewhere, within the water column above, nautilus move through daily cycles that align with gradients of light, pressure, and chemistry. Their chambered shells regulate buoyancy with a precision that allows them to shift between depths without continuous expenditure of energy. Their behavior, descending and ascending in response to environmental cues, follows patterns that would have been present in earlier oceans, a continuity expressed not through identical surroundings, but through the enduring relationship between organism and environment. The sediment itself holds the cumulative record of these processes. Each layer contains the remains of organisms that once moved through the water above, their structures broken down, transformed, and incorporated into a matrix that becomes part of the seafloor. Over vast spans, this accumulation forms a continuous archive, recording changes in chemistry, productivity, and composition, even as the individual contributors are no longer distinguishable. The physical conditions at depth remain constant in their essential character. The pressure exerted by the overlying water, the low temperatures maintained by the absence of solar heating, and the darkness that extends in all directions define a stable framework within which life persists. The slow descent of organic material, sometimes referred to as marine snow, provides a continuous, though limited, source of energy, sustaining organisms adapted to scarcity and patience. What differs between this present environment and that earlier one is not the underlying structure, but the specific arrangement of life within it. The organisms have changed, their evolutionary histories diverging from those that once dominated, yet the ecological roles they occupy remain comparable. The system continues to organize itself around the same principles, distributing energy, recycling material, and maintaining a balance shaped by physical and chemical constraints. The ocean floor has never ceased to host life. It has transitioned through different configurations, each defined by its own assemblage of species, yet always maintaining the processes that allow persistence. Within this continuity, the present moment is one phase among many, a configuration that will, in time, give way to another. In the darkness that exists tonight, beyond the reach of observation, organisms move without awareness of the history embedded in the sediment beneath them. They operate within a system that has extended far beyond any single lineage, sustained by conditions that have remained fundamentally stable even as the living components have changed. It begins not with sight, but with fragments, surfaces marked by impressions that seem at first incomplete, pieces of a structure that no longer exists in any direct form. From these fragments, a picture is assembled, not by memory or observation, but through inference, through the careful alignment of evidence until a coherent system emerges. This is a different kind of knowing, one that builds a living image from what remains after life has passed. Those who spend years with such material describe a gradual shift in perception. Individual specimens, once isolated objects, begin to connect, forming relationships that extend beyond the boundaries of any single fossil. The curvature of a shell suggests how it moved through water. The orientation of spines indicates how it interacted with current. The wear patterns on surfaces reveal repeated behaviors carried out over time. These details accumulate, and with them, a sense of the environment in which they belonged. Eventually, the reconstruction becomes immersive in a way that is difficult to describe in purely analytical terms. The arrangement of organisms, the spacing between them, the direction of flow across the seafloor, all align into a system that can be anticipated rather than merely described. A place that has not been seen begins to feel internally consistent, its patterns predictable, its dynamics understandable. The mind moves through it as though it were present, guided not by direct experience, but by the logic embedded in the evidence. What is striking is that this knowledge is derived entirely from material that has been altered by time. The original forms have been replaced, compressed, mineralized, yet they retain enough information to allow reconstruction at a level that approaches familiarity. The geometry of growth, the distribution of species, the chemical signatures preserved within the rock, each contributes to a framework that supports an increasingly detailed interpretation. This process does not recreate the past in a literal sense. It cannot restore color, motion, or the full complexity of interaction as it existed in real time. Instead, it produces a model, one that captures the structure and function of a system with a degree of fidelity that allows meaningful understanding. The result is not identical to the original world, but it is sufficiently accurate to reveal how that world operated. There is a quiet significance in this ability. It demonstrates that even in the absence of direct observation, it is possible to recover aspects of a system that existed far beyond the reach of any living memory. The methods involved are methodical, grounded in measurement and comparison, yet the outcome extends into a form of comprehension that feels almost experiential. At the same time, this knowledge carries an inherent limitation. It is always partial, always subject to revision as new evidence emerges. Each reconstruction is a step toward greater clarity, but never a final state. The world it describes remains fixed in the past, while the understanding of it continues to evolve. Within this process lies an awareness that is unique to the present moment. The organisms that once inhabited that system operated without any sense of the larger context in which they existed. Their behaviors were immediate, shaped by local conditions and immediate pressures, with no capacity to perceive the broader trajectory of their lineage. The reconstruction of their world introduces a perspective that did not exist within it. To engage with such a reconstruction is to participate in a form of connection that extends across immense spans of time. It allows the present to intersect with a past that is otherwise inaccessible, creating an understanding that is both analytical and reflective. The system that emerges is not only a subject of study, but also a reminder of the continuity that links different moments in the history of the planet. This form of knowing does not alter the past. It does not change the outcome of the events it describes. What it provides is a way to recognize that those events occurred, that the systems they represent were real, and that their traces can still be read, interpreted, and understood, even now. through the careful examination of what remains. A thin layer of silt settles across a surface that has never known stillness, grain by grain, forming a quiet record beneath water that moves above it without pause. Nothing announces the moment, nothing marks it as distinct, yet it joins an accumulation that has continued for spans beyond ordinary measure, a slow archive written in pressure and time. Within that long continuity, the forms that once occupied the space were not distant ideas, but living systems, each carrying out the processes that define existence. Arms extended into moving water, surfaces filtered what passed through. Bodies responded to gradients of light and chemistry with a precision shaped by countless generations. These were not approximations assembled after the fact, but complete organisms, functioning in a world that required no interpretation to be understood by those within it. The ground beneath present landscapes once lay beneath that same water, though its position has shifted through cycles of movement that rearranged continents and redefined the outlines of oceans. The absence of familiar markers, of later lineages and later structures, does not diminish the completeness of that earlier state. It was a fully realized configuration, operating under conditions that supported its own internal logic, sustained for a duration that extended far beyond any single moment within it. As that configuration passed, the processes that supported it did not end. Water continued its circulation through atmosphere, river, and basin, moving between states while retaining its identity as part of a larger system. The molecules that once surrounded those organisms have moved through countless pathways, entering and leaving different forms, yet remaining within the same planetary cycle. Some fraction of that circulation exists now, present within currents that cross modern oceans or within droplets that have recently fallen. The material built by those organisms followed a similar path. Structures composed of mineral and organic components were broken down, transformed, incorporated into new systems. Carbon fixed through biological activity entered reservoirs that persist in rock, in fluid, and in living tissue. Nothing departed from the system as a whole, only shifted into new configurations that continue to interact with one another. Beneath the surface of the present ocean, beyond the reach of light, a comparable continuity unfolds. The seafloor remains a site of ongoing activity, shaped by organisms that process sediment, exchange matter, and maintain cycles that have operated for immense spans of time. Many of these organisms have not been directly observed, their presence inferred through traces and measurements, yet their functions align with patterns that have long been established. The absence of awareness within these systems does not alter their persistence. The processes continue regardless of observation, guided by physical and chemical conditions that define what is possible within that environment. In this sense, the continuity is not dependent on recognition, but on the stability of the mechanisms that sustain it. What changes is the arrangement of participants within that continuity. Specific forms appear, persist for a time, and are replaced, while the underlying framework remains capable of supporting new configurations. The system does not preserve individual identities indefinitely, but it maintains the capacity for complexity, for interaction, for the emergence of structures that occupy the same roles in different ways. To consider this sequence is to recognize that the present state is one expression within a broader range of possibilities. The conditions that produced earlier configurations are not identical to those that exist now, yet they are connected through processes that have not ceased. The continuity is therefore both stable and dynamic, preserving certain principles while allowing for variation in their expression. The surface that receives each new layer of sediment remains part of that ongoing record. It does not distinguish between past and present in the way human perception does, but it retains the effects of what has occurred, integrating each contribution into a structure that extends backward through time. In this way, the floor and the darkness above it continue to hold the imprint of systems that once operated there, while also supporting those that exist now, forming a continuum that persists without interruption.